The auctioneer opened the bidding at $5,000, and the room went quiet in a way that told me everything I needed to know. Not the quiet of people considering, the quiet of people who had already considered and decided against. The particular silence of experienced investors communicating through their stillness that this property had problems serious enough that the opening price did not compensate for them, and that whoever raised a paddle was either uninformed or had information nobody else in the room possessed. I raised my paddle. Nobody else moved. The auctioneer looked around the room twice with the careful expression of someone confirming that what appeared to be happening was actually happening. Then he said sold. $5,000. I drove home from the auction house in Savannah, Georgia, on a Saturday morning in March with a receipt in my bag and the deed to a property I had spent 8 weeks researching and had never been inside, and that had been sitting in a county foreclosure inventory for 4 years with no takers. The Aldridge Estate, 4 acres on the edge of Savannah's historic district. A Greek Revival main house built in 1889 that had been appraised at a figure considerably larger than $5,000 before a combination of deferred maintenance, water damage, structural concerns, and the particular weight of complicated history had reduced the pool of interested buyers to exactly one person. Me. My name is Clara Webb, and I am 32 years old. I restore historic properties for a living. I had done it for 6 years. 4 completed projects in Savannah and 1 in Brunswick had been harder than anticipated, and they had taught me things about structural assessment that I applied to every project afterward. The Aldridge Estate was going to be my most significant project. I did not yet know that it would also be the most significant thing that had ever happened to me personally. That part I found out during demolition. Let me tell you what I knew about the Aldridge Estate before I raised my paddle. I had spent 8 weeks in the Chatham County Records Office, the Georgia Historical Society, and the Savannah Area Library's local history collection, building a picture of the property and the family that had built it. The Aldridge family had been prominent in Savannah commerce from the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th. Cotton brokerage initially, and then a diversification into real estate, and then into various business interests that had produced a family fortune significant enough to sustain a certain standard of living across 3 generations. The house had been built in 1889 by a man named William Aldridge, who had wanted a property that announced his family's arrival into Savannah's upper social tier. He had succeeded. The Greek Revival structure with its 4 columns, its wide front porch, and its 4 acres of grounds had been exactly the kind of statement he had intended. The house had stayed in the Aldridge family through William's son Robert, Robert's son James, and James's daughter Margaret, who had been the last Aldridge to occupy it. Margaret Aldridge had moved into the house in 1958 when she married a man named Franklin Cole and had lived there until her death in 2001 at the age of 78. She had no children. Her estate had been contested by distant relatives whose connection to the Aldridge family was thin enough that the legal proceedings had consumed most of the estate's liquid assets before producing a resolution that transferred the property to the county. The county had held it for 4 years. Nobody had bought it. The structural assessment reports cited significant roof damage, compromised chimney structures, and outdated electrical and plumbing systems as the primary concerns. I had read every word of those reports. I had also had a conversation with the county records clerk. A woman named Mrs. Beaumont, who had worked in that office for 32 years and who had the particular quality of someone who had processed more history than most people ever encountered and who had strong opinions about the properties in her files. She had said, "That house has been sitting there waiting for someone to look at it properly." I had asked what she meant by properly. She had smiled and said, "Not just the structure, the whole thing." I had filed that conversation away as the interesting observation of an experienced woman and had continued my research. 8 weeks later, I was sitting in my car outside the auction house with a $5,000 receipt. Mrs. Beaumont's words were still in the back of my mind. The structural assessment was accurate. I want to be honest about this because the story I am about to tell involves a discovery that was remarkable, and I do not want the remarkableness of it to suggest that the path to it was easy, or that buying a foreclosed mansion for $5,000 is a straightforward financial decision that produces uncomplicated results. It is not, and it does not. The Aldridge estate needed serious work. The roof had failed in multiple sections, and water intrusion had compromised significant portions of the upper floor framing. The main staircase required complete reconstruction. The electrical system was not merely outdated but dangerous. The plumbing was original in ways that were historically interesting and practically untenable. And the chimneys. The house had 6 chimneys. A structure of that size and age in Savannah's climate had required a significant heating infrastructure, and the Aldridges had built accordingly. Of the 6 chimneys, 4 were in acceptable condition, requiring maintenance and pointing work but not structural intervention. 2 were in the condition the assessment had described as compromised. Visible exterior cracking suggesting foundation settlement that needed to be addressed before any surrounding work could safely proceed. My contractor, Marcus Webb, had walked through the property with me on the first day and had said approximately 12 times in 90 minutes. He said it the way contractors say things when they are genuinely moved by what they are looking at and are trying to maintain professional composure about the scale of the work involved. I understood. Even in its damaged state, the house had a quality that was difficult to name precisely but impossible to miss. The proportions were extraordinary. The original woodwork was intact beneath decades of neglect. The plaster medallions in the main reception rooms had survived remarkably well. The heart pine floors under the water damage were some of the finest I had seen in 6 years of working in Savannah's historic properties. It was going to be beautiful when it was done. First, it had to be stabilized. Demolition of the 2 compromised chimneys began in week 4. Marcus assigned a crew of 3 to the north chimneys. Careful work. Historic demolition requires patience and precision. Each brick removed deliberately, assessed for salvageability, and set aside if it could be reused. The crew worked from the top down, which was the correct approach structurally, and moved through the upper sections of the first chimney without incident. It was midway through the second chimney that the crew chief, Darius, called me over. He was standing at the base of the chimney, looking up into the partially cleared structure with an expression I had learned to read over 3 years of working with him. Darius had seen a great many things inside old walls and old chimneys and had developed a specific face for things that did not fit the expected category. He was wearing that face. "Come look at this," he said. I walked over. I looked up into the chimney where he was pointing his flashlight. There was a void. Not the kind of void that comes from structural failure or material deterioration over time. The void had shape. Intentional shape. A rectangular cavity approximately 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep was built into the chimney structure at a level approximately 5 feet above the firebox. The surrounding brickwork was different from the original construction. Newer mortar, more careful laying, the specific quality of work done by someone trying to match existing masonry while concealing something behind it. Someone had built this space deliberately. How old is the new work? I asked. Darius examined the mortar composition carefully. He had the particular expertise of someone who had spent years working in historic structures and had learned to read materials the way other people read text. 50s maybe, he said. Early 60s at the latest. 60 years. Someone had concealed something in this chimney 60 years ago. Open it carefully, I said. The crew worked for another hour. What they found behind the concealing brickwork was a cavity that had been lined with lead sheeting before whatever was inside it was placed there. The lead lining had done its job across 60 years, protecting the contents from moisture and temperature fluctuation with the particular competence of a material chosen specifically for preservation. Inside the lead-lined cavity were 2 things. A metal box approximately the size of a shoebox, and a canvas bag that had deteriorated significantly, but that had preserved its contents through the combination of the lead lining and its own material integrity. Darius carried both to the folding table we kept on site for document work. He looked at me. I looked at the metal box. "Take them to my truck," I said. "I'll deal with them there." He carried them to my truck. I followed. I sat in the driver's seat, set both objects on the passenger seat, and looked at them for a long moment. The metal box had a simple latch mechanism that had corroded, but was not locked. The canvas bag was tied at the top with a cord that had mostly survived. I opened the metal box first. Inside was money. Not a fortune. Not the kind of amount that produces shock in the way movies suggest discoveries produce shock, but real money. A significant amount of Depression-era and post-war currency. Bills from the 1930s through the early 1960s, carefully wrapped in wax paper that had preserved them in better condition than 60 years inside a chimney had any right to produce. I counted it carefully. It took 20 minutes. The total was $11,460. In the denominations in the condition present, the collector value was considerably higher than the face value. Not a life-changing amount, but real. Significant. The savings of someone who had trusted a chimney more than they trusted a bank. Then I opened the canvas bag.
Inside the canvas bag were three things wrapped separately in oilcloth. The first was a leather journal. The second was a sealed envelope. The third was a smaller cloth packet that contained, when I opened it, a set of documents folded carefully and wrapped in wax paper identical to the money. I looked at the journal first. The cover was plain dark leather worn with age. No name on the outside. I opened it carefully to the first page. The handwriting was a woman's, precise and deliberate with a slight rightward slant. The date at the top of the first entry was May 1959. I read the first line. Then I sat back in the driver's seat of my truck outside the Aldridge estate in Savannah, Georgia, and felt the particular quality of a moment where the world has just become larger than it was a few seconds ago. The journal belonged to Margaret Aldridge Cole, the woman who had lived in this house from 1958 until her death in 2001. The last Aldridge. And the first line of her journal said this: I am writing this because I am the only person left who knows the truth, and I cannot take it with me when I go, and it deserves to survive me. I read for 3 hours in the truck. Not because I had planned to spend 3 hours reading in my truck on a Tuesday afternoon. Because I could not stop. Margaret Aldridge was born in 1923 into the third generation of the Aldridge family wealth in Savannah. She had grown up in the house on Aldridge Street, which was a different property from the one I had purchased. The family's original residence in the historic district that had been sold in the 1940s. She had married Franklin Cole in 1958 and moved to the estate on the edge of the district. She had been educated, perceptive, writing with the particular clarity of someone who had been formed by the kind of classical education that the wealthy families of her generation provided for their daughters, enough to think precisely and to express precise thought in precise language. She wrote about her family, about her grandfather William, who had built the estate, about her father, Robert, who had maintained and expanded the family's business interests, about her own generation's position in Savannah's social world and what she observed about that world from within it. Then she wrote about something that had happened in 1957. 1 year before, she married Franklin and moved to the estate. Her father, Robert, had died. The estate had passed to her as his only surviving heir. And in the process of settling her father's affairs, she had discovered something in his papers that she had spent the subsequent 2 years deciding what to do with. She described what she had discovered carefully and in detail. Her grandfather, William Aldridge, had built his cotton brokerage fortune in the 1880s and 1890s through a series of business relationships that had produced significant wealth. One of those relationships had been with a black entrepreneur named Joseph Beaumont. Joseph Beaumont had been a free man who had built a small but successful cotton trading operation in Savannah after Reconstruction. He had developed a reputation for reliability and for the quality of the contacts he maintained across the Georgia cotton growing regions. He had approached William Aldridge in 1887, proposing a business partnership. William Aldridge had agreed to the partnership. The partnership had produced substantial profits for both parties across 8 years. Then, in 1895, William Aldridge dissolved the partnership. Not cleanly. He had used legal mechanisms available to him as a white businessman in 1895 Savannah to take sole credit for the business infrastructure they had built together and to exclude Joseph Beaumont from the proceeds of that infrastructure going forward. Joseph Beaumont had tried to contest this. The contest had failed in the way such contests failed in Savannah in 1895. Joseph Beaumont had lost everything he had built. Margaret had found the full documentation of this history in her father's papers in 1957. Letters, contracts, the original partnership agreement, the legal proceedings of the dissolution. A letter from Joseph Beaumont to William Aldridge that had been kept in Robert's files and that Margaret described as the most painful thing she had ever read. She wrote, "My grandfather built what we have on the foundation of what he took from Joseph Beaumont. I have spent 2 years understanding what that means and what I am supposed to do about it." The journal covered 4 years, 1959 to 1963. 4 years of Margaret Aldridge thinking carefully and in writing about what she had discovered and what it meant and what her obligations were, given what she now knew about the foundation of her family's wealth. She had tried to find Joseph Beaumont's descendants. She had found them. Joseph Beaumont had had 2 sons and a daughter. His daughter, Sarah, had married a man named Clarence Webb. Their descendants were still in Savannah. Webb. My last name is Webb. I am Clara Webb. I sat in the truck for a long time after I read that. Then I read it again. Then I sat for a longer time. I called my mother that evening. Her name is Dorothy Webb, and she is 63 years old. She was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, and has lived her entire life within 15 miles of the house I am currently restoring. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Mom, I need to ask you something about our family history." She said, "What kind of something?" I said, "Do you know anything about a man named Joseph Beaumont?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you hear that name?" I said, "I found some things in the chimney of the house I am restoring. A journal. Documents." Another pause. Longer. She said, "Clara, come home." I drove to my mother's house. She was waiting on the porch. I brought the journal, the documents, and the envelope. We sat at her kitchen table, and I watched my mother read Margaret Aldridge's journal with the particular expression of someone receiving information about themselves that they had not known, and that is changing the shape of what they thought they knew. It took her 2 hours to read through everything. When she finished, she looked up at me. She said, "My grandmother talked about a great-grandfather who had been cheated out of a business. She never had the details. She said the family had started over from nothing in the early 1900s. She said, we don't talk about why." I said, "Joseph Beaumont." She said, "Joseph Beaumont." We sat quietly for a moment. Then my mother reached across the table and picked up the sealed envelope. She had not opened it. Neither had I. It had my family's name on it, not Clara Webb, not Dorothy Webb, the Beaumont family. Written in Margaret Aldridge's handwriting in 1963, apparently the ink and the paper are consistent with the journal's final entries from that year. My mother held it for a moment. Then she handed it to me. She said, "You found it. You open it." Inside the envelope were two things: a letter and a deed. Margaret had written the letter in 1963 at the age of 40. She wrote it knowing she had no children and no direct heirs, and that the house and the estate would eventually pass out of her control, and that what she was leaving in the chimney might not be found for years or decades or ever. She had written it anyway. She wrote, "To the Beaumont family, if this finds you. My grandfather William Aldrich took from your family what he had no right to take. He used laws that should not have existed and relationships that should not have worked as they worked to dissolve a partnership that should have made your family as wealthy as it made mine. I cannot undo what he did. I can only tell the truth about it clearly and give what I have to give." She wrote about the money in the metal box. She wrote that it represented her own savings accumulated across 5 years and set aside specifically for this purpose. She wrote that she understood it was not proportional to what had been taken, and that she was not offering it as compensation but as acknowledgement. She wrote that acknowledgement was the only honest thing she could offer, given that real compensation was beyond her ability to provide. Then she described the deed. The deed was for a small parcel of land, not part of the main estate. A separate parcel that Margaret had purchased in her own name in 1961, and that she had placed in a trust with instructions that I would need an attorney to fully parse, but that, on their face, appeared to designate the parcel to the Beaumont family descendants upon discovery of the trust documents. I held the deed in my hands. I looked at my mother. She was very still. I said, "Mom, this is land." She said, "I can see that." I said, "She bought land in 1961 and put it in trust for our family." My mother looked at the deed for a long moment. Then she said, "She didn't know if anyone would ever find it." I said, "She put it in a chimney and hoped someone would." My mother looked at the journal still open on the table between us. She said, "She spent 4 years thinking about what to do, and this is what she did." I said, "Yes." We sat with that for a while. I called an attorney the following morning. Her name was Sandra Osei, and she practiced property and estate law in Savannah and had been recommended to me by Robert Gallagher, who handled my business affairs. She came to my mother's house on a Thursday afternoon and read through everything carefully with the focused attention of someone who understood that what she was looking at was unusual and who was taking the time to understand it properly before saying anything. When she finished, she set the documents on the table. She said, "The trust is real. The deed is real. The trust was properly executed in 1961 and recorded with the county. It has been sitting in the county records this entire time," I said. "And the land," she said. "The parcel is approximately 3 acres on the south side of Savannah." She paused. "In 1961, it was in an area that was largely undeveloped. Today, it is a different situation." My mother looked at her. Sandra said, "Property values in that area have appreciated significantly over 60 years. The parcel, as currently valued, is worth considerably more than it was when Margaret Aldrich purchased it." She said the current assessed value. My mother sat back in her chair. I looked at the journal on the table. Margaret Aldrich had bought 3 acres on the south side of Savannah in 1961 with her own money and put it in trust for a family. She had never met as acknowledgement of what her grandfather had taken from theirs. She had hidden the trust documents in a chimney and lead-lined cavity, sealed with carefully matched brickwork. She had died in 2001 without knowing whether anyone had ever found them. We spent 3 months working through the legal process. Sandra handled everything with the methodical precision of someone who had decided this was the most interesting case she had worked on in 10 years of practice and was going to do it correctly, regardless of how long it took. The trust was valid. The documentation was sufficient. The chain of inheritance from Joseph Beaumont through his daughter Sarah, through her marriage to my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side, through to Dorothy Webb and Clara Webb, was documentable through birth and marriage records that Sandra's paralegal spent 6 weeks assembling. The parcel transferred. On a Wednesday morning in September, I stood in Sandra Osei's office with my mother beside me and watched the final paperwork executed and felt the particular weight of a thing that had been in motion for 60 years finally arriving at its destination. My mother was quiet for most of that morning. In the car afterward, she said, "A woman we never knew spent 4 years of her life thinking about what was right and then hid the answer in a chimney and hoped someone would find it." I said, "60 years later, someone found it." She said, "You found it," I said. "I almost didn't buy the house." She looked at me. I said, "The opening bid was $5,000 and the room was completely quiet, and I almost put my paddle down." My mother looked out the window of the car at Savannah moving past. Then she said, "Your great-great-grandfather built something. Someone took it. Someone else spent 60 years feeling the weight of that. And you walked into an auction room and raised your paddle." I said, "I didn't know." She said, "I know you didn't know. That's not the point." I said, "What is the point?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The point is that some things find their way to the right person eventually, even when it takes 60 years and a sealed chimney and a daughter who buys broken houses for a living." I thought about Mrs. Beaumont at the county records office. That house has been sitting there waiting for someone to look at it properly. Mrs. Beaumont, her last name. I had not thought about it until this moment. I pulled the car over. My mother looked at me. I said, "Mrs. Beaumont at the county records office, the one who told me the house was waiting." My mother stared at me. I said, "Do you think she knew?" My mother was very still. Then she said, "I think some things travel through families in ways we don't always understand." We sat in the pulled over car for a long moment. Then I drove my mother home. The Aldridge estate restoration was completed 14 months after I bought it at auction. It is a beautiful house now. Not perfect. I do not believe in perfect houses, but honest. The kind of beauty that comes from treating old things with the respect their age requires, and from understanding that the damage a building has accumulated is part of its history rather than something to be erased. The north chimneys were rebuilt with salvaged brick where possible and carefully matched new brick where not. You can see the difference if you know where to look. A slight variation in one section of the second chimney where the concealed cavity was. I left that variation visible. I left it visible because it marks the place where something important was found.
Marcus asked me once whether I thought about what would have happened if the auction room had been different that day, if there had been another bidder. I said I thought about it sometimes. He said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think Margaret Aldrich put those documents in a chimney and sealed them with lead sheeting and carefully matched brickwork because she intended them to survive until the right person found them."
Marcus looked at the chimney. He said, "And the right person was you." I said, "The right person was someone who would open a sealed chimney carefully enough to find what was inside it, and who had a reason to understand what it meant when they found it." Marcus thought about that. Then he said, "That could have been anyone." I said, "It was me." He nodded. Then he said, "What happened to Mrs. Beaumont? At the records office?" I said I had gone back to see her after everything was resolved. I had sat across from her desk and told her the full story. She had listened without expressing surprise. When I finished, she said, "My grandmother told me there was something in that house that belonged to our family. She said someday someone would find it." I had stared at her. She had smiled. She had said, "I have been watching that property come through this office for 32 years, waiting for the right person to buy it." I had said, "You knew who I was when I came in asking about the Aldrich estate." She had said, "I knew your grandmother Dorothy, I hoped." I had said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She had looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has thought carefully about a question for a very long time. She had said, "Because some things need to be found rather than told." Finding it meant something different than being told it would have meant. She was right about that. I thought about Margaret Aldrich writing her journal in 1959 and deciding that the truth deserved to survive her, sealing it inside a chimney and trusting the future. She had trusted correctly. The future arrived 60 years later in the form of a 32-year-old woman who restored broken houses and who raised her paddle in an auction room when nobody else did. My mother and I went to the park last October. 3 acres on the south side of Savannah, undeveloped still. Trees and scrub, and the particular quality of undisturbed land that has been sitting in one configuration for a long time, and that carries the silence of a place that has not been asked to be anything yet. We walked through it slowly. My mother did not say much. At the center of the parcel, there was an old oak tree that was large enough to have been there in 1961 when Margaret Aldrich bought the land. Large enough to have been there when Joseph Beaumont was building his cotton trading operation in 1887. My mother put her hand on the bark of the oak tree. She stood there for a moment. Then she said he never got what he built back. "Nothing changes that." I said, "I know." She said, "But someone knew it was wrong." And spent 4 years thinking about what to do about it. And did what she could. I said, "Yes." My mother looked up at the oak tree. She said, "That matters. Even 60 years later. It still matters." I said, "I know, Mom." She looked at me. She said, "Thank you for buying that house." I said, "I almost didn't." She said, "But you did." We stood under the oak tree on a piece of land that had been purchased in 1961 by a woman we had never met, as an acknowledgement of a wrong done in 1895 by a man who had used the laws of his time to take what was not his to take. 65 years between the wrong and the acknowledgement. 60 more between the acknowledgement and its arrival. 125 years in total. And here we were, standing on the land, under the oak tree, in October light. Some things take a very long time to travel from the person who sent them to the person they were meant for. But they travel. When they are sent with enough care, enough honesty, and enough trust in the future, they travel. Margaret Aldrich trusted the future. I was the future that arrived. I am still learning what that means. I think I will be learning it for a long time. And I think that is exactly right. Thank you for being here today. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need the reminder.